Hi, Andrea. And Raina, can you hear me?
Hi, Mirna. I can.
Cool, just making sure.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, how are you?
Good afternoon. It's raining here. How is everyone?
We are good so far in this place. I don't know about you guys, but all is well here.
I'm counting down the days until my children go back to school.
I
Yeah.
bet.
I was out last week and I went to visit my brother down in Katy. So during the whole week, I helped my niece and nephew with virtual learning and helping out with homework. And it's interesting.
Yeah.
If you ever miss it, let me know and I will let you practice again.
Oh, okay, absolutely.
Fun times.
I just thank God every day that I don't have to do this for my kids. It would be an absolute disaster. We got really lucky. God love them. ADQ, do you know if we have everybody is checked in? Are we expecting everyone?
So I think we actually, Mirna, do you know if there's anybody that may not be joining us?
No, I didn't receive anyone that said they could not attend. So far, we have 5 people.
Phil Wonke's coming.
I think so. I haven't heard of him not attending today.
Oh God, I was muted.
Hi, Tracy.
Hi, yeah, I was muted. I'm over here saying hi, but I was muted. So sorry, guys.
Eventually, we're all going to learn how to do lip reading. So,
Probably.
a new talent everybody's going to have in the world.
Oh my gosh. So, Andrina, are you guys actually in your offices?
Some of us are. So like today I'm in the office. Ethan and Michael are mostly, our other planner are mostly in the office every day. And some of us take turns coming in. So we're trying to make sure that we have enough coverage at all times.
Yeah. And I can see you, PJ, you look like you're in the office too.
I am in the office.
Yeah. So
I've never left the office. Actually, we're down to about half of our staff offsite. So, and then we've maintained that pretty much the whole time. So it's working out pretty well.
yeah, my only problem is my office has gotten invaded because my husband's company sent everybody but super essential people home. So,
Wow.
So we've had to find offices is the best way to put it. Because a lot of these companies are now not those guys, half of the employees will never go back.
Yeah.
So.
I know I'd say half of the people who are offsite want to come back and the other half kind of like it the way it is. So we'll deal with that issue as soon as we have to stop wearing masks and cross that bridge. I'll just say that.
Yeah. And I've worked like this for a while. So coming to y'all's meetings was like getting out of the office for me.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Well, let's see, it's 3:31. We got what, 7 people on this deal? So 4, 6, 7. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess technically we have a quorum, correct?
Yes.
I'll wait just a couple more seconds to see if someone pops in.
Give me a little bit higher.
I think we're going to need all of our time today, right? Maybe not. Maybe not. And I don't see any guests either, right? I'm not sure who MPA Trust gives.
That's Michael Petrosky. He's one of our
Oh,
planners.
I'm
Yes, sir.
sorry. Sorry, Michael.
Very good.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So this is the Unified Development Code Advisory Committee. Good afternoon. Glad you all could make it. It's good to see you again. So we do have a quorum present. And let's see, it is currently, according to my clock, 3:33, September 9th. And we'll call the meeting to order. Let's see, are you taking, Maren, are you taking the role, or do we need to do that?
I can do that.
Okay, I'm just. All right, so I don't see anybody signed up, any visitors in the house, which I'm kind of surprised because I got a fair amount of questions from different people in the industry, and I expected them to show up. Maybe they'll pop in here later, but we'll see. So anyway, since we don't have any guests, I will dispense with the procedures for addressing the committee. So let's just get down to the agenda. On the regular session, ADQ, do we need to discuss anything? It's item A is basically discussing how we're going to do this meeting. Is that any need for that?
Absolutely. I can just give a very brief introduction. We do have actually one guest that has joined the meeting. So if that, if the person wishes to speak, what we do ask is that they either raise their hand or add their comment in the question box at the time that we do open it up for public discussion and comment. That way we can allow that person to be able to address the board or the committee. But while we are, it is a virtual meeting, everything is being recorded. So we do ask that as persons do sign up to speak, that they do state their name for the record. But in the meantime, while people are not speaking, that we do ask them to mute the microphone. So then that way we are able to make sure that everybody is able to be heard clearly, and we're able to keep record and track of the meeting. So that's really all for us to say, and I'll turn it over back to you.
And I'm sorry, who's the guest here today?
Amy Lynn Payne.
Amy. Oh, Amy. Well, that's one who I thought would show up, but I didn't see her on here, so I'm sorry, Amy. Welcome. Okay, well, let's get down to the legislative regular agenda. And the first item is item C, discussion and possible action to approve the minutes of August 12th. I never saw those minutes. Did I miss something? Did anybody see those minutes?
Yeah.
Anybody else? Brian, Jen, anybody?
No.
All right. Well, I guess we can't approve them then, so we'll need to get them back on next month's agenda. Okay, so moving along.
Apologies, I couldn't find my mute button there for a second.
Oh, there they
when
are.
I click on the link in the agenda online,
Yeah.
they're not filled out.
No.
And so I agree with that we should table them until next time, but maybe we should fill them in.
Huh, okay. Well, so I don't know if we need to vote on that or anything. We'll just postpone it until the next meeting, right?
Yes, sir. We will need a motion to move this consideration of this item to the next meeting.
All right, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to reconsider the minutes of the August 12th meeting at our next scheduled meeting.
Okay. I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second
Yes,
it.
I second.
All
Brian.
right, here, 2 seconds. Tracy or Brian, thank you. All in favor? All right, thank you. Okay, let's move on to item D, discussion and possible direction on the proposed amendments to the tree preservation and landscaping standards of the UDC, particularly as it relates to tree preservation, removal, and mitigation. UDC General Amendment numbers 20-03. All right. Steve,
Okay, so Actually, Sharon, if I may start it off, this is actually going to be a shared presentation with both Ethan Hardwood, our senior planner, Steve McKeon, our landscape planner, and myself. So I'll go ahead and get us started and kick off on the discussion. But really, this is a continuation of our last meeting, from our last meeting when we started introducing to you to Chapter 8 of our Unified Development Code, which relates to all of our tree preservation and landscaping standards. As you may recall, during that meeting, we kind of like gave you that introduction, went over as to what consists of Chapter 8, what included, what are some of the standards. We even gave you a little bit of share with you some essential terms that you're going to be listening to a lot as we go through the discussion of these proposed changes and cleanup items that we need to be able to do to Chapter 8 of our Unified Development Code. But this item specifically is really to be able to start diving into the specific items that we need to be able to address and amend through this process. And as it relates to tree preservation, mitigation, removal, and pruning. And so the purpose for, if I can get this to change slides for me, just give me 1 second. There we go. So really the purpose of this, for this discussion today, is to be able to review a lot of those issues that have been identified in order to be able to address complex ambiguity in standards related to tree preservation, removal, and mitigation. And as we're discussing about those issues, be able to also identify and work through some of those possible solutions to address them. So before we go ahead and get started on that, as you can see here on the agenda, we are first going to be reviewing the list of issues that have been submitted by both members of the public as well as members of this committee that have been identified that need to be addressed. As you may recall at the last meeting, one of your homework's assignment was to be able to review that chapter, go drive around the city, go back to some of the old cases that you may be familiar with, and if any of those items that you have identified that says, hey, you know what, this is actually a conflict that I've come across in the code, or this is a standard that has caused some confusion, to let us know what those are so that we can make sure that we include them on this list and be able to address those. As you may recall as well, we kind of like group those into different focus areas. So we're going to be doing that today to make sure that we've captured everything and then be able to discuss those items that are specifically related to tree preservation. And with those, again, we're going to be identifying what those issues are, making sure that we've captured them all and that we have included them all, discuss them. And in that discussion, we're going to be trying, including, and we're going to be talking about what it is that we're trying to resolve, how it is that we got to where we are today, and how can we be able to resolve those issues, and then be able to validate them with you so that we have the direction from you to know how it is that we need to start drafting that ordinance to be able to amend the UDC how it needs it. And then we're going to be going over the next steps. And so this is just kind of like a recap as to where we have been. As you may recall, as part of the UDC annual review process, we always create a list of items that need to be, that we are going to be recommending to the City Council for them to give us the list, our homework, and the list of items that we're going to be working on through this annual review process. Of course, because of the pandemic, we weren't able to review that list with the UDC Advisory Committee before City Council approved it, which is one of the reasons why we're actually here before you today to make sure that we actually finalize that list before we start actually working on those amendments. But that list was approved by City Council back in July, and in that list did include a lot of cleanup and administrative items and so forth that were identified and approved by City Council in July. And now since August, we have been before you to go over those items that we need to identify and start working to prepare those draft amendments. And then once we get that draft put together, we'll start doing our part of our public outreach, make sure that we gave everybody from the public time to be able to comment on that final draft. Of course, we hope that the public will be able to continue joining us and providing feedback as we have the discussions, and then ultimately come back to you for a recommendation, PNC also for a recommendation, and then City Council approval. And so if you may, as you may recall from our last meeting, with all these issues related to tree preservation and landscaping, because there were so many cleanup items that we identified, we broke them down into different buckets or focus areas, if you will. So we have one bucket has to do with specifically tree preservation, removal, and mitigation. One focus area has to do with street yards, gateways, and parking landscaping requirements. And then the other focus area has to do with screening and water conservation efforts, as well as buffering requirements. And so here we have compiled a list of all the issues that we have already previously identified before, as well as any issues that you have shared with us since the last meeting, to make sure that we incorporate those. So really our goal for today, as mentioned, since we didn't really have a chance to create a list with you, we're doing that now. And we wanna make sure that we've captured everything, that we have not missed anything, because this is gonna be the list. This is the list that we are gonna be working on to move forward. And so a lot of the items that we have identified and that have been brought to our attention, if you bear with me for a moment here, one of them is considering establishing a threshold to identify those multi-trunk trees that need to be measured in order for when we're doing the surveying and when we're working on our tree preservation plan. And right now, our UDC does not establish really any sort of thresholds. It basically requires that you have to measure all the trunks in order to be able to determine whether that tree is a protected tree or a heritage tree. And so one of the items that has been proposed is that, can we potentially find another way of being able to identify which trees need to be measured based on the size of the largest trunk? So that's something that's on the table for us to consider and be able to review. Kind of related to that, another item that's on the table for us to review and consider is, do we include a definition in the UDC to really be able to clarify and make it clear what is a tree branch and what is a tree trunk? As you know, especially with multi-trunk trees, trees can grow in different manners and ways and shapes and forms. Steve, I'm sorry if I'm butchering all of this, but you know, being able to provide some of these definitions may be able to clarify, to really be able to identify how you measure a tree and what you're supposed to be measuring. In addition to that, it's been recommended for us to look at in adding a definition to identify hardwood versus softwood trees, because they may be interpreted differently. You know, our code right now does not do that. It actually does not reference hardwood or softwood trees anywhere in the UDC. It doesn't use those terminology. It basically groups all trees, you know, into either a protected or in the case of the heritage tree, it really specifies species, very specific species as to what are considered to be those. So that was one of the recommendations for us to be able to look at. Another item that was included for us is to be able to really clarify what is considered to be a protected tree, but more specifically, what are some of those trees that should be excluded from that definition. So as an example, you know, making it very clear that all cedar trees, you know, the ash junipers, the mountain cedars, are actually excluded from that definition. Another item that we're going to be reviewing under consideration is potentially excluding ornamental trees from the definition of protected trees. As mentioned, right now our protected trees are basically defined, it's any tree that's over 12 inches. And with the exception of very specific species that once they reach 26, they're defined to consider to be heritage trees. So is there a possibility, an opportunity, should we exclude ornamental trees from that definition? Another item is to be able to identify the applicability in the approval process to be able to remove protected trees that are located within the right-of-way or a public utility easements. There is some ambiguity right now in our code in regards to what that approval process may look like, or what that, if somebody does wish to remove a protected tree within the right-of-way or an easement, what the proper process to do that is. So really be able to clarify what that process and what would be subject to it. We've also are going to be looking at considering potentially doing a tree inventory either for new projects and or phase projects that will be developed over a large period of time, and that have surveys that need to be updated every, after 5 or 10 years. And just be able to really determine what some of those additional information we can include in the tree inventory to help out with those phase projects. And next, there we go. All right. So another item is to really be able to consider how we can prioritize the preservation of protected trees by allowing flexibility in certain design elements. As you may recall, you know, right now our UDC really prioritizes heritage trees. So we are able to waive or vary from a lot of our design features, such as setbacks and so forth, in order to preserve a heritage tree. So, you know, can we offer, should we offer that same privilege, that same prioritization to protected trees? So that's one of the items that we're going to be looking at. We're also going to be looking at considering established boundaries for calculating protected and heritage trees. And this could extend anywhere from, you know, what do we consider if for any trees that are within the floodplain, within a right of way? Do we consider just the limits of construction, or do we consider the entire property when it's a large development and there are phases and sections? How are we actually able to really determine what those boundaries are going to be when calculating protected and heritage trees? Also, potentially considering requiring additional information on the health of those trees. You know, in a lot of cases, we've seen right now our UDC doesn't really address that very well, and we have come across, you know, certain projects where because we don't know what the health of the tree is, it may cause issues down the line, especially for phase projects. So this is kind of like related to that tree inventory that I mentioned earlier, but it's to be able to see, you know, like, you know, can we start, you know, ask for some of this additional information that will help projects in the long run, particularly for large projects that may be developed in phases. We're also going to be looking at considering additional options for tree mitigation. As you may recall, the UDC only provides, I think it's 4 or 5 options to do tree mitigation. And in some cases, particularly for special projects, such as projects that go through the plan unit development process or that go through a development agreement process, we've been able to work on different mitigation options to be able to address tree preservation and removal in those situations. So how can we provide some of those additional options, include them in the UDC so that they may apply to other projects as well. And then also just considering when it comes specifically to tree removal, considering the situations where the required landscaping trees can actually be removed. The UDC specifies some very specific scenarios that says in these situations, you can remove any landscape, or I'm sorry, you can remove any trees that were required in order for you to meet landscaping requirements. But specifically as it relates to signage, we really be able to clarify what the situation is and when is it appropriate, what are the options for you to be able to remove some of those landscaping that are required by code, but because they present conflicts with signage in this particular case, they can actually be removed, or how can we do what can we do to mitigate that? So this is the list that we have specifically related to tree preservation, removal, and mitigation that we're going to be talking about and going into very detail later today during this discussion. In the other buckets, focus areas that we have, and I apologize, but sometimes it takes a little bit. There we go. All right, so as it becomes to street yards, gateways, and parking, you know, the items that we have in that focus area, in that bucket, include the use of artificial turf for single-family residential. Right now, our UDC prohibits that. And so one of the requests that we receive from the public is that, hey, can we consider for you allowing artificial turf in single-family, on single-family lots? The other item that we're going to be looking at are street yard requirements, but especially as they apply to projects that are either that are going to be developing phases, where in a situation you may have the very first phase going to be the building at the very back of the lot. So how do we address street yard requirements for that phase until that future phase, which includes a building closer to the street, is developed? Or in cases where it's not a phase project, but you do have a large property and the buildings are being located really back on the property, how can we address street yard requirements in those instances? So that's something that we're going to be looking at. We're also going to be looking at the applicability of gateway landscape requirements and how these relate to other landscape requirements of the code, where they may be in conflict or how they can help to be able to address the other landscape requirements, such as whether it's buffer yards or parking or street yard requirements and so forth. So really be able to clarify that. Also, looking at the landscape requirements for inventory lots related to auto sales use. You know, as you may know, auto sales have large parking areas for all of their inventory vehicles. And our UDC doesn't address that. You know, it addresses landscaping for parking. It addresses landscaping for other portions of the site. It addresses outdoor storage, but it doesn't really address inventory lots. So be able to provide and address how landscaping would be met in those circumstances. And then be able to address any conflicts as well between signage, utility easements, and landscape requirements. You know, kind of related to the gateway standards. As you know, gateway landscaping requirements apply is along the roadway, but that's primarily where we have easements. And in some cases, we have very large easements that do not allow for the required gateway landscaping, particularly shade trees, to be planted within that area. So be able to address that conflict. And then in our last focus area that we have, which relates to screening, buffering, and water conservation, we're going to be looking at screening requirements for alternative waste containers. Right now, our UDC is very clear on what those screening requirements are for dumpster enclosures. However, in circumstances where there may be having some type of other waste receptacle, it's not very clear how that would apply. So it would be cleaning up that language. But then also reviewing as well what are some of our non-residential landscape requirements, how they would apply in regards to the city water conservation efforts. This was also something that was recommended by both the public and members from the PNC, really be able to look at our landscaping standards so that we can address, you know, water usage and be able to promote for water usage. So again, this is everything that we have heard from the public, from staff, from you. Thank you very much for providing any comments and feedback. So before we go on and start diving into the tree preservation, which that reminds me, the items that are specifically related to street yard gateways and parking, and the items that are related to screening, buffering, water conservation, we're going to dive into those in detail at a future meeting. So at the next meeting, we're going to come back to you with street yard gateways and parking, and we're going to dive into those. Today, it's just going to be about tree preservation. But before we leave this list, because we want to make sure that we finalize it, we want to make sure that we keep our focus in working on these amendments. My question to you is how we capture them all. Is there anything here that's missing? Anything that you told us that we needed to fix, but we have not identified? Or that something since our last meeting, or since you last sent us an email, something that is not included in here that we need to make sure that we did? No?
I hear nothing.
I'm gonna say, this is your final chance. Last call.
All right.
After this, anything new that comes up, we're gonna have to wait until the next annual amendment.
I've got a message, looks like from Amy. Says is this an appropriate time to speak? I'm not sure who's monitoring the chats, but.
Yeah, so I just gave her permission to be able to talk. So Chair, it's up to you. If you wanna, we can finish with the presentation and then open it up for public comment. This is just the first part.
Amy, if you can hear me, I guess my comment would be is if you're addressing, have we covered everything? Is there anything new that we should add? Then maybe I would accept that for now. And if not, let's wait till the actual issue comes up and then we'll address it then. How about that?
PJ, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, super. I am happy to speak whenever or not. I just wanted to make sure I'm not real familiar with this format. I tried to get my camera up and running to where y'all could see me, but I can't find it on this screen.
That's
so
okay.
I will just be here listening, and I'm happy to speak at the appropriate time.
All right, let's just wait until your issue comes up, and you're welcome to chime in. And just, I guess I'm kind of new at this as well. So I think if you raise your hand, if nobody notices your hand is up, just go ahead and speak out and let us know that you have an issue.
Thank you.
All right. Go ahead, whoever's next on the agenda.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else, going once, going twice, last call, Final answer? All right, we have our list. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ethan. And he's going to actually, to both Ethan and Steve, between the two of them, we're going to start going very deeply into the tree preservation items as mentioned. And so looking forward to the discussion. Ethan?
There we go. So before I begin, I am fighting the rain on the roof above me. So if y'all can't hear me, please feel free to tell me to speak up. So what Steve and I would like to do for the rest of the meeting is go through each of those tree preservation issues, have a discussion about them, and identify, so have a discussion about the issues, talk through any potential solutions or amendments identified by staff as a starting point for a discussion. As we go throughout the meeting, you'll see on the left side of my screen a Word document where Andrea will be tracking our discussion, making notes about what we were talking about, and making notes on any other information that we may identify that we need in order to have the committee make a decision on an amendment or an issue. And hopefully, for most of our issues today, we'll be able to identify a direction so that we can, as a staff, come back, create not quite a draft ordinance, but a term sheet kind of identifying what we want the ordinance to do, and bring that back for your review and approval at our next meeting to make sure that we are taking the action that you thought we were going to be taking before we prepared draft language.
Andrea, can I interrupt a second? Would you rather let, I guess for just how we're going to conduct this, would you prefer that you do your presentation and then we all chime in with comments, or should we, can we interrupt with comments, or how would you rather do this?
Yes, so actually the way that we've set it up is that we are going to be stopping at every single issue. So we're going to be discussing about, you know, the issues that we went over earlier through that list, and then be able to kind of like give the members the opportunity to be able to talk through that as we go through each issue. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was just wondering if you want us to hold our questions to the end of each issue, or should we chime in the middle of it? I want to make it as efficient as possible. So I think maybe if we just wait and hold our questions until the end of your presentation for each topic, and we'll handle each topic as it comes. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds perfect, PJ.
Okay, thank you. Proceed, Ethan.
Yeah. So before we get started, Steve and I wanted to go over a few of those tree preservation basics, vocabulary and purpose that we went over last time, just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing as we go. So this is just a refresher. Our tree ordinance was adopted back in 2007, excuse me, with the intent of protecting our trees as a natural resource and as a valuable resource to our community that protects our aesthetics. You know, Georgetown sits both on the Edwards Plateau and in the Blackland Prairie, where trees both play a significant role in defining the aesthetic on each side of our city. Tree preservation regulations are focused on, they're divided between two different types of development. You'll hear us talk about residential projects. When we say that, we mean single family and two family subdivisions that are only responsible for protecting heritage trees. And when we say non-residential, we mean everything else. Commercial, any type of commercial or multifamily site that is responsible for protecting both heritage trees and protected trees. You'll also may hear us mention exempt properties. Those are going to be single family or two family homes that were platted, not necessarily built, but platted prior to the date of our ordinance adoption in 2007. So those are grandfathered out of our tree ordinance regulations. You are also going to hear us talk about tree diameter, or DBH. It stands for diameter breast height. That is the international standard for the way you measure trees. You measure and identify trees by the diameter of the tree at 4.5 feet above the ground. You're also going to hear us talk about the critical root zone. The critical root zone is a circular area around the tree that represents kind of the critical portion of the root ball. If that area is disturbed, if there's weight put on it, that is the area, that's the part of a tree that we're interested in protecting, because that is where you can do the most damage to a tree. Trees are divided into two separate classes based on their size and their species. So the smallest class of tree we have is a protected tree. Those start at trees those are essentially any tree that is not an excluded species that is 12 inches or larger. There's no cap on that. And heritage trees are any tree of a certain species listed on the screen that is 26 inches in diameter or larger. Those are your really big trees. You may also hear Steve talk about credit trees. Credit trees are any of those trees that are the 6 inches below our smallest class that can be used to help offset mitigation for a project. And then you may also hear us use the term excluded species, which refers to the species of trees listed on your screen, which are often kind of referred to as trash trees. They're not native, they're invasive, they're heavy water users, and they're things that we generally try to clean up and we don't really want to protect. We'll get into that in a minute. So our first two topics are somewhat related. They're all about the way we measure trees. The first issue is related to the way we measure multi-trunk trees. Currently, in our UDC, there's no exception made for multi-trunk trees. If you want to do a tree survey on a property, you have to go out there and measure every single trunk of every single tree to determine whether or not it should be included on the tree survey. I know there's some additional background from some of the members on the committee who may know more about why this was requested. But there are kind of three ways that we have identified to address this. The first would just be to continue our practices of measuring any tree and every tree. The second could potentially be to establish a scale. So to help you identify which trees need to be measured. So the diameter of a multi-trunk tree is assessed by taking the full diameter of the largest trunk and adding it to half of the diameter of each subsequent trunk. So potentially we could identify a trigger that would require you to provide the measurement for every trunk of a tree. So for instance, if you knew that a tree had the largest trunk on a tree was 5 inches, and you knew that it had 3 more that were smaller than that, well, that may not add up to 12 inches for it to be classified as a protected tree. And so we may be able to come up with some sort of sliding scale to help you identify what needs to be measured exactly. And then the third possible solution that we identified was to just provide educational materials that would help you, that could help somebody doing a tree survey to identify what they need to measure and what they don't need to measure so that they're more efficient with their time. The second item, which is related, so we'll lump these two together, is about creating some definitions and standard practices for that. You know, when you go out there, you have a really funky looking live oak tree. How do I determine what is the trunk and what is actually a branch? So these are some standards from the International Society of Arboriculture, who's the regulating body for arborists around the world, on how they define each of these terms. These are things that we could include in the UDC to help make measurement better. So we would like to open up for your thoughts and discussion.
Well, I guess I'll go because these first few issues are ones that I've presented to the committee. And just full disclosure, I own an engineering and surveying firm, so we're involved in a whole lot of the surveying of these trees. But I almost would go and start with the issue of kind of back to what you said. It's on non-residential tree surveys, we're required. It says specifically in the UDC, we're required to measure all trees over 12 inches. And then I know it's jumping maybe a little bit ahead, but it really does come back to this issue of measuring trees. Do we want, does the city really require all trees over 12 inches, or is it all protected trees over 12 inches? Because all trees is a lot of trees. Not that I wouldn't love to survey all of them, but you know, do we really need that? I mean, I always figured that the intent was all protected trees, which are defined as a certain type of species. But if you look at all trees, do you want us to survey every single hackberry and cedar tree and, you know, all of the ones that we consider trash trees? And I bring that up because, and it goes back to this issue, is that if, and I'm going to show you this picture, if we're required to measure all trees, including, that would include cedar, and this tree, I don't know if you can really see this, but that's a typical cedar tree right there, that there are probably 11 billion of those in the county and the city limits. You know, how do you even define that? Where's the trunk in that tree? You know, so there's, that Crepe Myrtle you're showing on there right there is actually a pretty good, it pretty much is the same as the cedar tree. It's like, where would you even consider the trunk? And so I'm kind of blending two of the issues here, but they kind of do go together. So my first question is, was the intent to measure every tree over 12 inches or every protected tree over 12 inches?
I'll go ahead and chime in on that. So the way the code does read, protected trees are viewed as any species 12 inches or larger, except for the ones identified under Chapter 8, Section 8.02.020. So the code already identifies specific species that are not required to be measured. They are generally requested to be identified because some of those species are on our controlled or prohibited list for the city, which requires that they are removed when identified. So you're not necessarily having to measure them, but you're at least having to identify them on the site. When it comes to the cedar, simply identifying that as a cedar tree and giving it a tag number, as most surveys generally do, that's good enough because that's what we're looking for,
Well, going back to the ordinance, Section 805.020, non-residential trees, it's a very strict sentence. The tree survey shall graphically identify the location, size, and species of all trees with a DVH of 12 inches or greater. It doesn't say except those, not considered, whatever the words were. I forget.
Right.
So again, I mean, my firm would be happy to locate all these trees. It's, we make a lot of money doing that, but I just can't imagine that, that seems to me a pretty big burden on the development community to have to locate a bunch of trees that you're going to just mow over anyway. So I don't know. That just seems to be a lot of extra effort for something that's really not necessary. That's my opinion. So.
Yeah. And it sounds like
I'm curious about the other members if they had any comments on those.
I completely agree with what you're saying. Maybe we need to specify that this is hardwoods only, because a lot of these cedar trees need to come out anyway. So if we just identified them as a cedar and went on about our business, it would save a whole lot of people a whole lot of time and money. So I agree with what you said, PJ.
I'm also in agreement that, I don't know that we need to identify unless you, in your review at the city, you want to see or just regulate, okay, now get rid of all these trees. They're going to do that anyway with the cedar trees, I think. And even identifying them on a survey may not even help I don't see the benefit of that necessarily, unless you can clarify that. But going back to it, I agree that I don't think we should have to identify anything that's on the excluded list for sure. And then I'm kind of going to weigh in a little bit on the ornamental trees. Is they're typically not what we're trying to keep, which is the shade trees. Those are the ones that are going to help us with putting shade on the site. So those are my two comments.
Yeah, I just think it's overkill to locate something that's already identified as trash. So why even bother to locate it? I mean, again, it does take time to stop and locate each tree, even especially if you have to tag it, it's even more time. Surveying has gotten a lot quicker over the years due to technology, but it still does take that much more time, and you physically have to walk to every single tree and locate it. So if it's not even a quote unquote tree anyway, why do you should only care what we're required, what we care about. I mean, you should only locate what trees we care about, and those are the ones you've identified already. So
Yeah, so I'm curious, for PJ, Philip, and Jen, who work with this every day and go out and do these surveys, I'm also curious to hear from Steve's perspective. We've talked about a lot of the cons for excluding for not including the excluded trees in the survey, but are there any benefits to y'all as you consider design or feasibility on a site? Just make sure we cover all of our bases.
There's
Cedar,
really no
no.
benefit from my perspective. We get more money, which isn't a reason to have them. But a lot of times I find that, we're arguing with, well, is it a trash tree or not? And I think that could come up maybe with you guys. Do the reviewers agree with the species of the tree? But we can just ask the surveyor to seal it, and then that's as good as we need.
yeah, and I think locating, and this is another thing, is to me, it's easier to tell a survey crew what is a good tree, because I think there are fewer good trees than there are bad trees. So if I can say the following is a list of the trees that we want to keep, I think, and then everything else beyond that is trash. I mean, that might help even with that situation. And back to Philip on ornamentals, I totally agree on the ornamentals. Why should we locate a bunch of crepe myrtles that, it is just that, it's an ornamental, or we can ask, what's the whole purpose of the tree location or the tree preservation in the first place? Maybe we need to discuss, why do we even have this? And that might help define why we either do or don't need ornamental trees.
PJ, are there any rules about what trees that you can take out, so-called trash trees? Are there any rules about not taking those out? In other words, can you cut those down at will?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, cut down the trash trees?
Yes.
Yeah.
Steve, could you speak to that? Do those need any review
Yeah, as
to
far
be
as
removed?
you can cut them down, but that's the city's question, I guess.
Well, I can't see taking the time to identify and map trees that can be cut down the next day anyway. So perhaps that would be the rule.
Steve, this kind of leads into the question I have for you. Is there any benefit to seeing every tree on the site, including the excluded trees for you as the reviewer?
So the main benefit is just to identify all the trees on site, so there is no confusion as far as what is getting removed and what is not getting removed. We don't want cases where a number of trees weren't identified, but because the cedar trees or the hackberry or something was so large, there was another tree that should have been protected within that grouping that just was overlooked. So that's part of the process. That's part of why we ask that all trees are identified on the survey. To speak to the other question, as far as if there's any other limitations for what those trees are used for, there is. As I mentioned earlier, if it's considered a prohibited species, then those are required to be removed. If it is considered a controlled species, those species can still remain on site as, if nothing else, just providing more shade, lowering any kind of heat index or anything like that on the site. They do not require to be removed. However, they also are not any additional benefit, which means they don't apply towards any credits that you would see when it comes to fulfilling landscape requirements. Trees of that particular class would be a hackberry. We don't require that those are removed. They don't then apply towards any credit if they're located in a buffer or something like that. The biggest benefit of just keeping those in is either part of shade elements that you're going to get, natural screening, at least helping with that natural screening along any potential buffer areas. There are arguments that can be made when it comes to an administrative exception. There are cases where the natural vegetation along what generally might require a buffer yard between two zonings is thick enough that that buffer yard is then not needed. So, to be able to identify that on plans and in surveys, if we don't have that information shown, we can't justify an exception like that without having all that displayed.
Well, I hear you on that. For years, and we've been surveying. I've been at this company 23 years, and this was never even really an issue until the last few years. I don't know where the wording changed in the UDC. Maybe it changed and we just didn't notice it, but we got called to task on, maybe, I think it might have been by you, but one of our jobs where we didn't bother to locate the hackberries, and then it was in a project closer to town. And, the comments came back, what about these hackberries? We were like, why would we locate those? We never have before. Well, and then it was pointed out to us that it really does say all trees over 12 inches. Well, I'll tell you, for years, we never did. And in fact, we would tell some clients, to help save you some money, go down and mow down all the cedar trees and all the trash trees, and it'll speed up us locating all of the good hardwoods. We tell them, we'd educate them on what trees were good, and most 99% of them knew what those were. They don't do that all the time, but sometimes on a larger lot, they'll go ahead and clean out all the trash and then leave it for, makes it easier to locate all the other ones. So I guess I've said enough about it, but it just seems like a waste of time and effort to have to locate something you're going to get rid of anyway if it's already been designated as trash.
Well, if I may interrupt for a second, we also have Heather Brewer, our urban forester, on the line. I know that, Heather did a lot of the work that Steve is currently doing now before. And you mentioned, previously PJ, so maybe she can give us a little bit of perspective on the history of that and if something that changed. And Heather, do you mind addressing a little bit as to how we've been doing it in the past?
Okay, so hello, this is Heather. PJ, I'm looking at 85020-1A, and I think to your point, if we added the word survey all protected trees, that would take care of your concern about surveying all the hackberries and chinaberries. I think it's a benefit to have that information for Steve, because when you're in the conversation of a plan review, it's good for him to know, okay, there's an area over here on this side of the property that's just all juniper and chinaberry. What if he has the ability to say, okay, well, we can move this building footprint over to that area and not have to remove any protected trees. Therefore, the client wouldn't have to pay any mitigation as well. I think perhaps doing a survey for those tree species and showing them on the plan, but perhaps not measuring them, would be a helpful tool because it gives the reviewer a fuller picture of the property that they may or may not have ever been on.
And I understand that. I think that's a good point. If you're talking about maybe in the city type situation, you're around other houses, but if you're out in a 2 or 3 acre tract, kind of, removed from everybody else, I mean, it's generally not that big of an issue, or in a more commercial area, but I don't know. If it were just up to me, I would have corrected it like you said. I would have just said, instead of just all trees, I would have just said all protected trees, but.
So it sounds like we're pretty unified on the idea of revising the language to exclude the excluded tree species. Could we put together, maybe 1 or 2 versions of that for y'all to review next time at our next meeting?
Sure.
The only additional thing I'd like to say, Ethan, on that is we may want to state that if there is a potential credit, like was mentioned, that around a buffer edge next to a adjacent property, that the developer may want to take credit for some of the trees to keep it dense, then they need to survey them. I think if we say they want to get something out of it, they need to survey them. Otherwise, just protected makes sense.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I like that. It leaves it up to them to determine whether or not they locate it. So I think that's
right.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. The other issue that we were kind of taking in this chunk was about the idea of establishing and adopting these official definitions to help guide measuring of trees. Do y'all feel like that kind of establishing a clear picture of what is a trunk, a branch, and a stem would be helpful?
Well, since you asked, I've been reading over that, and it seems the word stem seems to have 3 different meanings.
Yes, they use stem to define branch, and they use stem to define a trunk. Yeah. So.
Well, I think this is quickly another one that I think, TJ, you might just weigh in on a little bit. What are the issues that are out there when you're surveying on a site, when your guys are out there?
Well,
that opens up questions.
I'd say the biggest issue is probably how to define, well, kind of like that picture I showed you, when it's really not obvious what the trunk is, and that happens more than you'd think. And I think we're pretty good on trees that lean over. I mean, we can make an opinion on those, but generally it's the multi-trunk scenarios, and there's a lot of motts of these oak trees that grow. I don't know how to describe it, but it's kind of like you have maybe 4 or 7 branches, not branches, but what would look like a separate tree growing out of an area, maybe in a 5 or 6 foot diameter area. And it's like, you could almost define, the main trunk would be like almost an inch or more off the ground, but not really a trunk. It's just kind of like where 4 branches grew up and turned into trees. And so that's the one that we get a lot of head scratching on a lot of times about, are these 4 trees or is this 1 tree? That's kind of the question you get. And
do you feel that a definition of what is a trunk would be more helpful, or do you think that kind of maybe some details like these details from the ISA would be more helpful as a visual to understand the different kinds of trees we get?
The more definition, the better. I mean, we try not to leave too much interpretation because there's big penalties for missing trees. So my charge to my guys is, when in doubt, locate it. We'll get someone else to tell us what it looks like. Get the forester out there or somebody. But anything you can judge. The graphic you have up there now, we have, they've seen that before. So I don't know if there's anything more graphic, or we can send you examples of weird trees, and we can, like I said, the one I just described, is it 1 tree, or is it 1 tree with 4 branches, I guess you'd call it, or is it 4 trees? But they're all kind of joined at the ground. So what is it? I can take a picture of that. Maybe I'll just send it to you offline and we can talk about that one.
Yeah, I think a clarification might be, is there a certain height off the ground that you need to physically see a connection of trunks to call it 1 tree? I don't know if that's true or something like that would be helpful.
I like
Definition.
that. Yeah, that's good.
So for our next meeting, if we brought you back some revised definitions that use a better word than stem, and that maybe address some conditions that we see here in Central Texas more often, would that be amenable?
Bring it on.
Yeah, that's great.
So speaking on that, I think some municipalities close to Georgetown say 4 feet off of the ground is where you measure that. So maybe we should make sure that whatever we come up with is kind of in line with, like, I'm just gonna say it, with Round Rock in Austin and the Taylor ordinance.
Yeah,
We
so
already-
that's actually,
That's actually already defined in our code. So it's a standard measuring height of 4.5 feet above grade. You know, we don't have, there are other cities that use, that actually reference this table that you can see here, where it gives you a generalized location for when and where you take that measurement, depending on the situation. But you know, per ISA standards and our city standards, it's always 4.5 feet above finished grade.
Yeah, we do Travis County and other cities as well. That's correct. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I have a question because I'm not a tree ordinance guy like you folks, but where did the 12-inch come from? Because I noticed other cities seem to have a higher number than 12. You know, I don't want to open up a can of worms, but I guess I just like a little education on that, especially when you get into this multi-trunk stuff.
So the exact answer to that, I'm actually kind of hoping maybe Heather could answer that.
Okay, so actually, I believe most of the cities around here have a smaller protected tree size. Most of them are at 8. 12 was landed on 2 rewrites ago. And like I said, we did a overview of other cities around near our size and what they were doing. And most of them are at 8 or 6 as a protected tree. And all I was able to get was 12.
Okay. No, I appreciate it, Heather.
Thank you.
so Tracy, that's actually something that we'll also have more discussion about here if you have other thoughts as well. So the next 3 issues are kind of related to each other as well. So I think I'll group them together again. Issue number 3 was a request from a committee member to add a definition for hardwood and softwood trees. Oftentimes we're talking about protected trees versus what we may call trash trees in casual conversation. We talk about the difference between being hardwood or softwood, and that is most likely true in casual conversation, but the UDC actually doesn't make any reference to those being hardwoods or softwoods at all. So protected trees are any tree of a certain size, and heritage trees are just any trees 26 inches or larger of a certain species. Request number 4 was about excluding all cedar and ash, juniper, from either the protected tree or the heritage tree classification, which is something that we already do as one of those excluded species. And then issue number 5 was about whether or not ornamental trees should continue to be considered protected trees. Staff's take on it was that if we do not count if we do not count ornamental trees as protected trees, then they cannot be counted as credit toward mitigation. But we proposed that we could exclude ornamental trees that might be considered prohibited. So for example, the picture on the left is the vitex or the chast tree, which is considered prohibited, but I actually took that picture of it growing down on the South San Gabriel. So y'all have thoughts, questions for discussion?
Well, again, I think these are my issues that came from my office, so I'll start with it. But and I think we've covered a lot of it already. But Yeah, I had one comment from my office about the hard versus softwood. I frankly have rethought that. I'm not comfortable with calling them hardwood versus softwood. I think that it makes the definition more vague. I'm more for calling out exactly which trees we either locate or we don't locate. Whichever is the smaller number of trees, and I think the smaller number is the type of trees that we want to keep, because there's so many other quote trash trees that you know. So whatever's the smaller number, say, well, these are the trees we want is protected, and these are the ones and everything else doesn't matter. And I don't really have much of an opinion on the ornamental trees. I kind of agree with your take on the ornamentals. If you don't consider it a protected tree, then why should you get credit for it? But those are my points. So.
Are there any other thoughts on hardwoods versus softwoods?
I don't really have any comments on it. I think I do like what PJ said, that if we can be a little more specific so that it's easy for people to follow what we want to keep and what we want to survey, then that would help in this situation. There are plenty of softwood trees that people want to keep and serve a good purpose. So.
Perfect. Any thoughts on continuing to exclude cedar from the protected and heritage categories?
Yeah, I think we should certainly. That's my opinion. Yeah, but again, it goes back to, you know, should we include ash juniper and cedar? What's it, mountain cedar? Or, you know, how many different varieties? You can get into so many different varieties of cedar. Do we really want to talk about all the excluded ones, other than if we define the ones we want to keep and just say everything else is a trash tree? I don't know. I'm just saying, make it simple, whichever issue you go with. But my opinion on the ash, I mean, I guess that's more of a question for Heather, but you know, I don't know. I don't know anybody. I've never met anybody that likes a cedar tree.
Like that.
I've personally met a few that have pretty manicured cedar trees, so more of a residential type setting. But
they obviously haven't lived here very long. But anyway, no, that's okay. I understand. There's always one.
Hey, it's Brian. I did have a comment. What the chairman was talking about, hey, maybe we start with what is the purpose of all of this? Really, I've been thinking about that as we've been talking, because the purpose kind of defines what's good and or not. And I thought of that saying, hey, we need to separate the wheat from the chaff. And in that saying, you understand that you're looking for wheat. The wheat is what you're looking for, and the chaff is what you're not looking for. Chaff is in the way. And it seems like we have a system where we've required people to weigh every ounce of chaff along with every ounce of wheat, even though we've acknowledged that we don't want chaff. So I agree with you, Mr. Chair, that if we just kind of focus on the things that we want and then leave it to others to decide, hey, do you want to keep things that are not required? I don't think it's efficient to say, well, it's good to know every tree on a lot, 5 acres wide, because then we can make decisions. Well, we've made decisions by identifying up front, here's what we value. This, and this, and everything else we do not value. It's up to you, property owner or developer or whoever, to make decisions about those things. But here's what we want. Everything else is up to you.
Thank you.
Mm.
Anybody else?
So currently it sounds like we're looking to clearly identify the excluded trees, which for the most part we do already with the code. And then as far as the term hardwood and softwood, those terms are general terms that people have just come to use. I know it's thrown out a lot in pre-application meetings, things like that, the term hardwood, but we don't define those terms. We don't use those terms in our code. Our code is specifically identifying species that are heritage and species that are to be excluded. There is only one city that I'm aware of that actually attempts and has that in their code. I don't think it's necessary because it's not the aim for us as the city that we're trying to save, a hardwood over a softwood. So does everyone agree that as long as we are identifying species specific to protected or heritage only and excluded only, that's the way to move forward?
Most people could not give you the definition of a softwood versus a hardwood. I can't, and I've watched New Yankee Workshop for years. So I would suggest that we stick with a specific list of trees. What could be simpler than that? You could go as far as saying, here are the ones that you can't cut down. Everything else, we don't care.
This is Brian. I completely agree with that. I don't think, in colloquial language it may be okay, but I don't think in code we should be talking about hardwoods and softwoods. They're not technical definitions.
Great.
Agree.
Okay.
So when we start talking about issue number 5 in ornamental trees, PJ, you said that you understood why they needed to be included, so they could be counted as credit and not mitigated for. Are there any other thoughts on either including or excluding ornamental trees in the protected tree definition?
Well, I'm not sure what you just said is accurate. On the ornamentals, if we're going to include them as a protected tree, then yes, we should locate them. Otherwise,
okay.
So.
Yeah, I think it could be used the same way I brought up about the buffer trees and all that. If a developer wants to count them as credit, he must survey them so that they're locked in and we know what's there. If they can be used for credit. Otherwise, it's not the desired list. So, but it sounds like this is more of, do we call them protected or not is the question, right?
Really, the question is, are they a tree you have to go up there and locate and measure?
Right. Correct.
And mitigate for if you remove.
And so that would be what we would define as a protected tree. So if I were to tell my survey guys, all right, when you go out on this lot, I need you to locate all the protected trees. And I can hand them a list and it says these 12 trees are the only kind of trees you need to care about. Everything else, don't worry about it. Now, it may not have a crepe myrtle on there if that's what y'all determine, and that's okay. But, the owner may come to us and say, dude, there's a 25-inch crepe myrtle that's about 120 years old. It's been out here forever. It's a gorgeous tree, and it's blocking half of my neighbor's yard. I don't want to cut it down. I think it'd be great. Maybe we can get credit for it. That's where I would come back to you guys and say, okay, well, let's talk about it. Will we get credit for this?
And PJ, so the only trees you can't get credit for are the ones that are listed controlled or prohibited. So we've had sites come in where the majority of what you get is crepe myrtle, but we've had sites where a crepe myrtle has reached that protected size, and that does count towards your street yard or towards your gateway, depending on where that tree is located.
Okay.
I think excluding ornamentals from identification all around isn't the best practice that we should really aim for. I think we should focus more on excluding the controlled possibly and the prohibited from actually being measured. As long as they're identified, that's what I'm looking for as far as, we've at least identified these trees on site. But yeah, I don't believe a surveyor necessarily has to go out and actually measure every single cedar tree.
Well, they may not have to measure every cedar tree, but, but according to what you just said, should they locate every cedar tree?
The cedar trees, they should be located as far as, I mean, I'm not 100% sure what it takes to locate on a survey. I mean, I know
So
that
it takes the same amount of, well, let me rephrase that. If you're out in a mott of thick cedar,
Mhm.
it can take a long time to locate all of those, just because you got to, you know, how thick that stuff is. You got to cut in there with chainsaws and machetes and all that just to get to the point where you can stick the survey rod in the middle of that tree and show, you know, the crew where it is. You may spend 10, 15 minutes cutting a line just to locate one tree in a big thick cedar area. But if my guys what they'll do is they'll walk a grid through these sites, and they're looking. What they do is they go through there first and they flag up all the quote good trees, right? And then they can narrow down and kind of work into where they got to go to locate those trees. But if they have to locate every single cedar tree in there, I mean, depending on the site, but you know how most of these sites are, you're talking about 4 to 5 to 6 times more effort just to locate all those trees, which, you know, you're talking about 5 or 6 more days of surveying versus maybe a 2-day survey job. So, you know, you add up the numbers on that, it goes up pretty high. And again, that's, you know, I'm happy to do it, but I don't think the developers are very happy that we have to pay that kind of money for that. But
Yeah.
so,
Well, all that's going to do is end up making the house cost more.
right.
Either there's a list of the trees that you can't cut down, everything else you can. There's no point in putting on the protected list anything that you can go out that night and cut down with no penalty.
So what right now we're talking about something different than what we currently have. Currently, the UDC establishes we have a list of trees that you don't have to worry about, and everything else you do. Like, you know, there are these 5 species of trees, and you don't have to worry about counting those, measure and locate everything else. The discussion keeps coming back to a list of trees that you do need to worry about, instead of a list of trees you don't need to worry about.
Right.
Is that what I'm hearing?
It is. And my point was, whichever of those lists is a shorter list is the one you should be your marching orders. I mean, I don't know. Are there more trees that we care about than we don't care about? You know.
Yeah. So to me, the issue, marking the trees that we don't need to worry about is a shorter list, number one. But then number 2, it's a finite list that doesn't limit your options later on. You know, if we make a list of trees that you do need to worry about, you know, different kinds of oak, pecan, hickory, walnut, whatever there may be. But let's say we don't include maple on that list, you know, then we're in a rut later on down the road when we're on an old farm and they have a maple tree or something. I don't know if that's realistic or not. So to me, this is the shorter, easier list.
All right. Well, locate every tree except these then. I mean, you know, I don't
know. We're back to just running up the price of whatever's going to be built there. The problem, the situation is there's a penalty for making mistake on the protected list. There's no penalty for making mistake on the non-protected list. That means that the protected list needs to be specific and complete.
Right, and I agree with that. All I was saying, if you're gonna tell us to locate, or here's the trees that you don't have to locate. Steve was saying go ahead and locate them anyway. Just don't put a size on them. I'm saying don't even locate them at all. Period. Just, you know, why locate something that we don't care about anyway? And I know what you're saying is, you know, if they want to use that for credit, but that goes back to what Phil said. You know, then we make that determination at the time with the owner, and he said, you know, we can maybe get credit for this buffer over here of trash trees.
Right. So if I may interject a little bit. So the direction that we received from when we were talking about that item was precisely for us to basically clean up the UDC, to make it very clear that you only need to identify, survey, measure are the protected trees, right? So anything that, basically all the trees except for those trees that are in this excluded tree list. This particular item is that we're currently talking about right now, item 5, it has to do more with the ornamental trees, right? Because there was, whether they, so the question becomes is that because right now under today's definition, an ornamental tree that's over 12 inches, excluding those are the ones that we are already excluded. So it does not include any of the cedar trees. So forget cedar trees. But any other ornamental trees that are 12 inches or greater are right now considered to be protected trees. So this item right here is the question is that, do we want to consider ornamental tree? Do we want to continue considering ornamental trees as being protected trees? And then, so there's definitely a lot of advantages and value for us to having them. As Ethan and Steve had discussed, you know, a lot of them, they are used for mitigation. They are used for credit. When we talk about even new landscaping requirements, and we're talking about alternative solutions, in a lot of the cases, we use ornamental trees to mitigate and meet the requirement of shade trees when shade trees cannot be planted. So there is a value and a purpose for wanting to maintain those ornamental trees because it also contributes to other requirements of the code. So really the question that's on the table today is that, do we continue as we've been operating right now and including ornamental trees, which means that yes, you will have to identify them and measure them if they're over 12 inches. Again, except those excluded trees. So forget about the excluded trees. Or do we want to consider an alternative solution to that?
Well, not to beat a dead horse, but if you want to keep something, it needs to be on the protected list, period.
Correct.
And right now, the ornamentals are not on the protected list, correct?
They are. They are
Okay,
right
well,
now.
the list I saw a minute ago did not have any ornamentals on it.
So
The
the
previous-
protected list is just everything that is 12 inches or larger, excluding the trees defined in our UDC. So excluding all the hackberries, chinaberries.
Yeah, the list is only the trash trees, so to speak.
Yeah, so that is the protected list at this point. And the reason that's set that way is so that we don't end up with only a narrow grouping of species out there. We have more variety. We have more cultural species of trees.
Well, how is PJ going to explain that to his crew?
The best way to do that is to say, these are the trees that are excluded. Do not survey these, or, you know, only show them in the general area. That's what we need to work out here.
Okay, but what about a crepe myrtle?
If it's over 12 inches, then it has to be located. That's what you're saying.
Correct.
But I did not see it on the protected list.
So we don't have a list of specific species for a protected tree like we do a heritage tree. A protected tree is any tree, any species greater than 12 inches, minus the 5 species that are on the screen.
Okay, but from a I'm sorry to be argumentative about this, but from a practical matter, I need to know which trees I need to put on the list, on the map, and I need to know which ones I can cut down. I can't do that if there's too many distinctions between ornamental, heritage, this, that, and the other. I need a list.
So Stuart, to answer your question, in that situation, kind of like to PJ, in those situations, yes, you would basically identify every single tree except these 5.
No matter what size, those trees right there are not located.
Correct.
And all I'm saying was earlier, Steve was saying we still need to locate them, but we just don't need to give a size. And I would say I wouldn't even give a size or locate them.
Right, and that was the direction that we got, and that was what we discussed before. So before, the direction and the recommendation was that we do not even locate these 5. right?
It would be okay to tell my guys, locate every tree over 12 inch except these 5, 8, 10, whatever we come up with trees. Yes, that would be acceptable.
I will go with that if it's made perfectly clear that you don't need to list those 5, and if there are no ambiguities in what you might be obliged to list. For instance, the question about the crepe myrtle is, how do you measure crepe myrtle?
Yeah, crepe myrtles are hard to measure. A lot of them are. I won't say all of them, but most of them are hard because they got multiple trunks, like that picture you showed.
Yeah, I agree with that. That may be one clarification we need for that particular species and others that have multi-trunks is perhaps there's a way to identify how many trunks, is it the 5 largest? Is it the 4 or 3, something to find out if it's a 12-inch tree as opposed to, measuring all 15. That may be one clarification that can help. And Adriana, you made a good point about how the ornamentals can be credited. I agree with what you said on that.
I mean, you could have a crepe myrtle that has 8 1-inch, or not 8, 12, 13 1-inch little branches coming off of it. And that's technically a protected tree. But when you look at it, you think, really? Is that a protected tree?
So
that's not unusual.
Yeah, could we bring y'all back 2 options for next month in relation to issue 5? Could we bring you back an option that still shows ornamental trees as a protected tree, but then also an option that may discuss, on an ornamental tree, you measure the 4 or 5 largest trunks?
Yeah,
That's great. Yeah.
Looking at that Vitex, that's another example right there. I mean, so yeah, I like it. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Would y'all agree that my wings are that? Apologize. So, issue number 6 relates to the way that we treat trees that are located in the right-of-way or the public utility easement when there is work being done in those areas. So, our UDC provides an exception for trees that are located in the right-of-way or public utility easement where there's work being done. But so they're not treated exactly like trees would be on a regular site. However, the exemption there, exception, I apologize, not exemption, only discusses heritage trees. It doesn't give us any direction on protected trees. So currently, the way that reads is that heritage trees that are in the right-of-way don't require a permit if they're to be pruned, if the pruning is being done by a certified arborist. It then further goes on to say that if a heritage tree in the right-of-way needs to be removed, then the person filling the position of urban forester at the city can approve that. Typically, both of these actions require a heritage tree removal or pruning permit that needs approval from the Planning and Zoning Commission. But because it's in the right-of-way or the PUE, that is directed to an administrative level or no administrative review at all if it's being done by a certified arborist. Currently, our practice to remove protected trees is actually to submit a site development plan application. However, with the new shot clock rules, that just takes time. And so currently we don't really have an administrative way to review for protected tree pruning or removal in the right-of-way. And even then, when we do have a way to do that through a construction plan permit or some other type of permit, they get treated just like they would be if they were on a site. So our solutions today really revolve around whether or not language should be included in the UDC for this issue, similar to heritage trees regarding pruning and removal. And do y'all have any discussion points on that?
So why would you not come up with a new permit that's a tree removal permit that you could work with the city attorney and not have to go through the shot clock process?
So that's definitely an option. So currently, we have the heritage tree removal permit, but because trees are a subdivision regulation, our city attorney has made a determination that those are still subject to shot clock. But even then, the tree removal permit would not require you to prepare so much material as you would for a site development plan. So that could still be a reduction in burden.
I think that would be good to just find a new permit to do this.
Yeah, if there are many situations where this can occur without requiring a site development permit, that's probably appropriate, is to have a permit process for that.
Okay.
That'd be my idea.
So currently, heritage trees in the right-of-way don't require a permit for pruning if they're done if the pruning is being done by a certified arborist. Would y'all feel that that was appropriate for protected trees as well?
Who polices that?
Steve?
Currently, that applies to utility-based work. It's just part of our code. It's ultimately kind of policed by the utility company.
So we're allowing the utility company to self-police on if they're using a certified arborist.
That is correct. It leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to the review and work that's been done. But that's kind of what we're looking to develop, potentially that permit process that maybe it goes through permits versus planning and zoning, because that's kind of the direction that utility work is currently going. That way it does not force them through the P&Z process. So that's in a sense the idea behind this, is that we have a way of reviewing this work that's being done to make sure it's being done correctly, and to make sure that mitigation is assessed when needed.
Yeah, so I mean, the con to that is going to be that, you would essentially be slowing them down because now they have to go through the process. But, allowing someone to police themselves is not always a great thing either. When we do that, then there's a lot of room for interpretation of certified and what does that mean exactly. So I kind of have a problem with them policing themselves, and I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah, so with our own utility companies, we're the ones policing it. So, that is generally not the issue, not the concern. I've seen site development plans that actually, have all that information, everything I'm looking for. When it comes to the work, that's generally contracted to a certified arborist. It's more or less getting the other utility companies, providers, and the agreements that we have with them to at least have a set standard for the submittal process, that they're identifying the trees located within these PUEs or within the right of way. So like I kind of mentioned, the current process right now has been to submit it through permit, which by submitting it through the permitting department, that's not required for them to then go through planning and zoning. Problem is, we still don't have that actual permit defined, that process defined. So.
Does this come up a lot? Is this a problem?
I'm seeing it more and more come up, especially with a lot of the internet-based companies trying to get in, trying to run lines, things like that. So. you know, our code specifies the requirements for heritage trees. It just doesn't address the requirements associated with the protected trees.
I don't know if this has been a big problem. I don't have much opinion on this.
Okay, what we can do is bring you back next month, some language that kind of mimics what we currently do for heritage trees in the right of way. Would that be all right?
So, and what you're saying is a heritage tree needs a permit, but not, it doesn't have to go through P and Z, right? For in the right of way.
Correct.
Why don't we just say anything over 18 inches or some number like that, and that kind of covers a lot of the protected and a lot of the heritage, or all of the heritage.
Oh, take the
Just lower the number then to, which is the same procedure for all trees over X size. Does that make it simpler?
well, I think the issue I could foresee is that you say everything 18 and up, 18 inches and up, but then Atmos Gas comes in and they've got a 17-inch tree. So then what do you?
I don't want to
You need to figure out what happens on that end.
on the side. I'm just saying, you know, combine all of them into one permit. Anything in the right of way needs a permit, and it's got to be this size.
Yeah, I think if we said protected and heritage, then that would cover everything that we typically have
All right,
that we regulate anyway.
well, come up with something. I guess we'll talk about it. We need to move on.
Okay.
All right. It's 5 o'clock too, by the way, so I guess we've got a fair amount of issues left, right? Everybody good? All right, move along.
Yeah, we got 5 more. So, issue number 7 is about a tree inventory versus a tree survey. So, currently our code allows you to do one of two options. You can provide the tree survey, which identifies the location, size, species, and status, usually meaning dead or alive, of a tree. But it does also include some language that encourages you to provide a tree inventory when possible. And that tree inventory simply done by a certified arborist and just includes a bit more information about a tree regarding its health. Is it diseased? Is it on its way out? Is it dying? That sort of thing. We have recently seen a lot of examples of projects where this extra information could be helpful in number one, determining whether trees were worth saving or not, or whether changes need to be made to the design to save. So they're paying to remove trees that are already dying rather than paying to remove healthy trees. We've also seen issues with projects that are phased over 10, 15 years, coming in, 8 years, 9 years after the tree survey was done, which is still within the time frame a tree survey is valid, and the health and situation of the trees that they have previously identified as being saved has completely changed as property around it has started to develop, or just because they're 8 or 9 years older now. So we are wondering whether or not we should consider, so our code requires that every 5 years and 10 years you provide an update to tree sizes on your tree survey because they've grown. And so the question here is whether or not requiring this additional information on those updates or just up front would be a useful in better evaluating those trees. Steve, can you speak a bit more to that?
Sure. So as Ethan touched on, the idea of the tree inventory is, in this instance, come the 5 and 10 year evaluation of a site in the survey that was originally done. the tree inventory could be used to identify the health of those trees in lieu of a tree survey. So, and whether we require all of the items that we've bulleted here, or if we only require specific items to be identified on that tree inventory, that's up for debate. The intent of it really is to identify health and well, pretty much health, identify main issues that we are starting to see with oak wilt and just the disease side of the decline of trees that are initially identified as healthy and trees that are going to be saved per the requirements of the development, things like that. So, you know, yeah. So a lot of it is to consider the option or the replacement of the need of a tree survey at that 5 and 10 year mark. We also are wanting to look at, when it comes to phase projects, you know, not all phase projects extend the 10-year mark, but in the case that they do, or they're even longer, this would be something that would be beneficial up front to know where problem areas are on the project, and have that record initially for the developer, so that down the road or up front, they're able to control those issues and not see a loss of tree canopy on their project, which in a lot of cases are beneficial. Residential developments, it's beneficial for the sale of lots. So, you know, that's what we're looking to try and get a better handle on with the option of the tree inventory, as well as pretty much reducing the spread of any disease within a development that would eventually affect trees identified up front and promised to be saved. So.
Any thoughts?
So this is being presented as an option for the 5 and 10 year, or also an option for upfront? Is that the way I'm understanding it?
Correct. Yeah. So it's being presented as an option to actually be written into the code, because right now it just tree survey is what's required. It's the language that's actually in the code, but it's not the only thing that they're limited to. So this would give the option on new development coming in, as well as the 5 and 10 year mark, or do we adjust the 5 and 10 year mark and just require a tree inventory, just require a status of health and size versus a full-blown tree survey?
Or update, yeah. What I've experienced, and this is just, you know, at times in working on projects, particularly in Austin, where it's very dense and there are a lot of trees in some of the undeveloped areas, a lot of developers would get an assessment based on the City of Austin's criteria. I don't think it's required all the time, but they would get an assessment from an arborist to really identify if they thought some trees weren't, you know, going to be required to be kept where normally they would based on their health. And so it is a tool that they've used to understand the site and really put the buildings where they can be put, and not just held back if the tree was dying or had issues with it. So that being said, I think having it in 2 ways, having it as an option to better plan the site up front, could give them some lenient, I don't know if it's leniency or whatever, but in decision-making upfront part. The one about the 5 and 10 year, I agree. I think that's a good idea, that if you've already surveyed this and you just need an assessment to make sure it still qualifies for your next phase or next development, that may be appropriate. So those are my thoughts right off the bat.
Can I ask for clarification, Steve? When you say it's not either, okay, on the inventory, would you actually locate where the trees are? Because if somebody's developing a site, obviously they want to know where the trees are. So would that be, as part of the inventory, would that still include a survey or a location of the trees?
It would. A tree inventory does identify as well as locate trees on a site. So they do have that option available. It's standard, I believe it's standard with the tree inventory, just because they're going out and they're looking at the trees on the property. They're looking to assess the trees, so they go ahead and identify them as well. In a lot of ways, a tree inventory is very similar to a tree survey. It just goes into a much more detailed look at the property and the trees on that property.
So is that something that an arborist does, or do you do that? The city does that, or who provides that?
That's something that an arborist handles. So they have the ability, they have the background, and they're the ones that provide the tree inventories.
I'm just thinking, as a developer, why? Not that they're all concerned about just cost, but what's the benefit of doing that versus just getting an updated tree survey? What's the benefit to the developer?
Well, so now this can potentially lead into other incentives. As Phil had mentioned, I know that the city of Austin, when they take this into consideration, there's, in a sense, a scale that is used to rate possibly a reduction in mitigation. So if a tree is identified as healthy, poor, dead, obviously no mitigation, maybe there's a percentage taken off the mitigation requirement for any poor species or poor health. So okay, there's ways that this process can actually be incentivized to the developer. This also helps in future drawn out processes, because we have to go through P&Z now. If come phase 5 or something, a number of trees have died that were considered heritage, that weren't initially identified up front, that's going to force them into another 30-day plus scenario where they're having to hold off on doing anything.
Okay.
So,
I get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anybody else?
So in general, y'all feel like this is a good option to encourage through the code?
Yeah, I think it's good to encourage it and identify where it can be beneficial. I don't completely understand, I guess, when we do the language, if it's ever going to be required. And if it is, then what are the criteria for that? And we can evaluate it, I guess, at that point.
Yeah. If I can go ahead and move on to number 10. It's related to this one, just to make it next to it in the slide deck. This is, issue number 10 is related. It's also about tree inventories, but potentially requiring them upfront at the beginning of certain types of projects. Definitely instances where this isn't valuable or useful to anybody on certain types of projects or projects that are, on a certain scale of acreage. However, there may be instances where this is useful. particularly in maybe large residential developments or developments where we are negotiating development standards through either a development agreement or a PUD. Steve has also identified some ways in which this could help him track diseases like oak wilt, as it spreads through the city. Do y'all have any thoughts on potentially requiring or encouraging a tree inventory for certain types of projects or applications?
Well, my comment is on is requiring versus encouraging. I'm always a big encouraging guy. And I think, the more you require, and I've sat on these other committees about affordable housing in Georgetown and the area. Every time you require something, that just raises the price of housing in this area. But I like encouraging, if there's, if you can make it worth my while to offset, maybe you'll give me more of a break on this if I do this, So that's my comment.
I think there could be some instances where, like you said, a long-term development and or multi-phase, that at times like that, more information is better for the long run. Yep. That we may want to consider that. I understand the thought behind it. I agree with PJ that, any additional cost just gets translated to everybody else, but we need to look at those positives and negatives, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
And in something like a PUD or something that is a negotiated agreement, more information is better oftentimes. And if we can make better decisions up front, then it can kind of ensure that it's going to be good for the long term. So I agree with that part of it, that if it's something a little non-standard, then going through this process could help in some of the decision making and making better decisions.
Yeah, I think developers, they like a bag of options, and if you can provide them with options, I think that's a good thing.
Okay, so if we could explore some options to potentially provide incentives in exchange for providing this information, would y'all be open to discussing those at the next meeting?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, so if we'll jump back to issue 8. Issue 8 relates to some provisions in our code that allow us to alter development standards in order to protect trees. So currently in our UDC, at the administrative level, the planning director can alter pretty much any development standard if it means saving a heritage tree. So there have been instances where we have reduced setbacks so that someone could push their home out of the critical root zone of a tree and build a nice custom home around a heritage tree. There have also been instances where we have very drive aisle widths and the required amount of parking in order to accommodate for the tree. One issue with that is that the UDC currently states that is permitted through a permit called a heritage tree priority determination, which is not actually a type of permit we have on our fee schedule. So if we could work on establishing some clear approval criteria for that, for the planning director to consider, and establish that as something that can be processed through an administrative exception, like we do all of our other administrative determinations. That would be a big cleanup for us as a staff. We also believe and have heard that there are some opportunities to expand those to certain sizes of protected trees. I may have a 26-inch heritage tree that I can request these alternatives for, but I may have a 25-inch protected tree that I cannot. But it's still worth saving and worth working the site around. So one thing that we're proposed here is to, number one, clean up the heritage tree issues that we have. And then also we propose expanding this to maybe certain sizes or groupings of protected trees. Do y'all have any thoughts on that?
Sounds like you're heading the right direction, I think.
I'm always curious what happens though when you make a deal like that I don't know, say we gave up parking or we allowed more impervious cover to help, save a heritage tree, and then the heritage tree dies and you're kind of left with all that other stuff. How do we rectify that issue?
So in instances where we have reduced parking, we have had the applicant also provide information about how much parking their use will actually require. And then, we're not going to allow them to give up parking spaces that are absolutely critical and they're going to wreak havoc on the neighborhood and people start parking on the street or that sort of thing. In other instances, if the tree dies, I'm not real sure what we would say about that. I guess we'd say we tried.
I think that would depend on how it died. And we would always encourage that they replant. If the tree is tied to requirements for that site, then they would need to replenish that requirement. So there is always that. If we gave an exception here because this tree was saved in addition, and then the tree dies down the road, obviously that's a code enforcement type issue, but they would be required to replace that through more than likely a combination of mitigation and of on-site planting, as well as possibly even the fee in lieu if they didn't have room to plant on-site. So
that just came to me. I don't know. I was just curious.
Yeah. So this isn't something that we encourage just willy-nilly. The administrative exception process still has 4 approval criteria that the applicant has to make their argument for, and that we as a staff have to find findings in relation to. So number 1, that it serves an obvious and a needed purpose. Number 2, that it would ensure an equal or better level of design than if they just straight complied with the UDC. Number 3, that it's not going to adversely affect adjacent properties or the physical character of an area. And then number 4, that it's consistent with the intent of the code. So there are parameters in place, and we do our due diligence to make sure that we make smart decisions.
Gotcha.
On that.
Okay.
Number 9 is about the boundaries in which the boundaries, can't ever say this right. Number 9 is about the boundaries in which we are considering a project as it relates to their tree preservation plan and mitigation. Steve, you can probably explain this one better than I can.
So with this one, we're taking a look at areas such as floodplains, right-of-ways, overall limit of construction on a site, potential phasing and or sectioning out of a much larger project. The goal behind this is so the background behind this is boundaries are generally just determined by the property line, right? So if there's a 5-acre lot and you're only dealing with 1 acre of it, your boundary and the area in which you are able to account for overall tree counts on your site is the full property boundary, not the specific area in which you're doing the work. Leander was one city that excluded a floodplain area from the use of mitigation counting. So that goes both ways as far as having to remove any trees in there, having to survey any trees in there, and then obviously counting them to adjust all your mitigation numbers. Like, that's not required. That's kind of the route that we're looking to go with this as well. Proposing this, we came up with excluding trees located in the floodplain. Generally, this area is not built in, so there should be no big disturbance occurring in these areas, as well as to include anything within this area. There's no guarantee that, you know, next year we'll have a 100-year flood and half these trees will get removed in that flood type of situation. So it protects against that. And then, as well as another solution would be just to evaluate the tree removal criteria and consider areas along existing and proposed right-of-ways. So considering when right-of-way is given, but yet not actually installed with the project, areas like that, the idea is to remove any trees from that area ahead of time so that it's not included in the mitigation, it's not included in the calculations for what was protected, with the understanding that those right-of-ways are eventually going to be either expanded or utilities will be run down, and the work required for mitigation on trees in that area will happen at that point, not with the project itself. And then another solution for this would be limiting the calculation process for mitigation and protected trees to just the limited constructions on a project. This ensures that the project is still maintaining a high level of mitigation on site, as well as maintaining the existing tree canopy on site. That way, you know, if you have a much larger site where the grouping of trees are located, the majority of the trees are located somewhere else on site, the area that's being developed isn't just mowed down and becomes, you know, just raw earth with no existing tree canopy on it. So that's the point of number 3, is to focus those mitigation calcs around just the limited construction of a site or a future expansion or an addition, things like that. And then 4 was to phase on phase projects. The mitigation is meant to be able to stand alone independently per phase. So we've gotten projects in where, you know, a full subdivision will come in and be platted and then phased into 5 phases. And then during the process of those build outs, one phase is heavily guarded with trees while another phase is not. And through the development of the project, when it comes to the end phase, well, something's come about during everything, and they aren't able to maintain or retain the promised or required amount of protected trees. So the object behind 4 is to get it to where each phase or section can stand on its own and meet those minimum requirements that we have for protected and mitigation. So that's pretty much the intent behind this.
I think it makes sense on the right of way. I mean, the floodplain, if you've got a large floodplain on a piece of property and you're not planning to touch anything and you don't need the credit, let's say, as a developer, then it's nice to not have to go in and get those surveyed, I guess, in this particular case. And I know that part of the development issue is you just want to make sure that whatever you're disturbing gets counted and mitigated for. So I agree with the limits of construction at times for certain, you know, for projects. I guess the option could be there to use the limited construction or use the entire property, depending on how that's going to develop out, if I'm interpreting it right. And then I haven't thought enough about 4 yet.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more thought goes into some of these. I mean, they seem okay on the surface, but I'm just wondering how, when you get into percentages of the development and future phases and all this stuff, or, you know, what you're gonna run into.
Is this more focused towards subdivisions, residential subdivisions? Or is it considered throughout on all the different types of developments? What's the main focus here?
It's meant to address throughout. Majority of where we see this is residential, because those projects are phased out so far a lot of times. But all projects have the potential to be affected by the floodplain. All projects have right-of-way requirements. So whether those requirements are, you know, simple or more extensive when it comes to a right-of-way type scenario, that's all dependent on the actual project. But the phasing is generally a residential. It does occur in even commercial projects, large multifamily projects that the city views as commercial, can even have phasing. So, yeah.
So quickly let's look at one real quick when we're talking about the 100-year floodplain. Do you consider the trees in the 100-year floodplain to be at risk, so we shouldn't count them towards mitigation, or just shouldn't have to bother with them at this point?
They would be viewed as risk, so therefore they would not be part of the mitigation requirement. But that means that you're not removing and you're not counting trees within that floodplain area.
Seems to me
The only concern. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, PJ.
Well, I'm just saying, if you're talking about the city limits of Georgetown, and I guess the ETJ as well, if you're in the Edwards Aquifer area, you can't do anything regardless in the floodplain. So why would you have to mitigate trees anyway? You know what I'm saying? You can't. There's almost zero development in the 100-year floodplain.
Right. So that 100-year floodplain solution is more of a clarifying. It's just adding it to our existing code as a clarifying measure.
Yeah, so the point number one is more about using existing trees in the floodplain towards your mitigation credit. Because it's not an area that you're disturbing, it's not an area you're building in. It just happens to be, you know, those are on your site. So the question is really, should those be eligible towards your credit, or should it be, or should they be excluded because they're not in an area you're disturbing?
Yeah.
And where if you've got a former farmland, I guess, you know, developer wise, most of the trees are located in the floodplain. I don't know that I believe completely they're at risk because they've been there for a long time, but and I do know some developers count on that as part of the overall. This is my property, so I'm saving all the trees here or getting credit for them so that I can do what's required up here. That's a consideration we need to understand.
Yeah, I agree with that last part. I think they're looking to use that to help with their project, but
so in that scenario, it could be more difficult to develop a piece of property. I say more difficult, more costly, because you're having to plant trees, more trees to mitigate and not take credit for what's in the floodplain. That's, I think, what's at issue or the question here.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Is this something that we can get you more? Are these 4 items something that we can get you more information on to talk about next time? Examples or maybe further clarify the statements?
I think so. I think because it's always good to understand where and you've done some of it of where it's coming from, but more like what are the specific issues we've encountered that this needs to be fixed?
Okay, we can
That's
certainly do
I
that.
think, a very good way to handle it.
Okay, we can put together some examples.
Okay.
Okay. We've already taken care of number 10. So number 11. We only have one more after. This is our next to last issue, but it's probably one of the larger issues. So currently our UDC, whenever trees are removed, the developer is responsible for mitigating for those trees that are removed. And currently our code lets you choose from 4 options to mitigate for those trees. The first option is that, number 1, you can replant trees on the site at a certain ratio of inches removed to inches planted. You can pay a fee in lieu option that goes into the city's tree fund that's used in beautification projects in the city's parks and along roadways and capital improvement projects. You can help the trees that did remain by aerating them and fertilizing them, ensuring that their health is secured. And the last option it provides, which is not commonly used, is the off-site replacement method. So most likely this would be planting in a public space like a park. The trees that you would have planted on your site, planting them in a park. But of course that requires approval from the Parks and Recreation Department, which is not difficult to work with, but it's just an extra step that can seem cumbersome, right? And so for that reason, it's not often used because it involves a whole nother negotiation of where do these trees actually get to go. So in this, we've identified 4 issues or 4 opportunities to either provide more flexibility, to address some discrepancies in the code, or to provide more flexibility. So the first option is really to address the discrepancy. There are, as we've talked about before, the range of protected trees is large. It goes from 12 inches to 25 inches. But currently a 25-inch tree is assessed a lower mitigation rate than the 26-inch tree, although their removal of it may result in the exact same impact that needed to be mitigated for. On the screen, you can see that other cities in our area have more ranges of protected trees, more different classifications of trees. And so there's an option there to create a kind of a middle classification that has slightly different mitigation ratios than the highest and the lowest end might. The second issue relates to the minimum percentage of trees that are required to remain on a site for protected trees. It's very common that that when a site is developed, a developer will come in and say, hey, I can't achieve my project if I stick to your minimum percentages of trees that remain. And our code allows you to apply for an administrative exception to deviate from this, from these minimum percentages. One issue there is, number 1, that provision isn't listed everywhere it needs to be in the code, more of an administrative issue. So we need to clean that up. But also we really want to encourage people to stick to these percentages. And so one way that we might do that is by assessing 1 mitigation ratio for everything, for instance, up to 70%, and then a higher mitigation ratio or higher fee for everything above that 70% removed, to help encourage people stay within their ratios. The third issue relates to on-site mitigation. Right now, there's a lot of ambiguity really in the code about that Steve can speak to more. But writing language into the code to really encourage plantings in common spaces in the neighborhood, HOA parks, along trails, entry corridors, entry monument signs, encourage those plantings so that they're going back into the site where the trees were removed from and still providing a community benefit there. We've also had a request from a developer to consider allowing mitigation trees to be planted in residential street yards outside of the control of the HOA or the city. And then the last one Steve can speak to more is a kind of a practice that we've seen in some developments, but essentially what number 4 is proposing is to create sort of an escrow account for a developer to allow them to pay their mitigation fees up front, get construction plans approved, and as they go and build and finish a section, let's say of a residential subdivision, they can provide their on-site plantings and get reimbursed for the tree funds that they actually didn't use. Steve, did I explain all this correctly?
Yeah. So our code currently does require a tree mitigation plan to be submitted with construction plans. That requirement stays as part of the process. 4 is really to allow, instead of the upfront cost to the developer of, well, instead of the required mitigation upfront without any possible credit back on it, they're allowed to put it in, and then as everything gets planted and verified, that money is then given back to the developer. So that's the intent of 4. We don't have anything like that currently in place. Right now, it just goes into our fee in lieu requirement, and that's it. So here we would actually be able to set something up and be able to shift that money around depending on if changes to the site occur that the original proposed mitigation plan didn't account for. So anything like that, it gives us as the city more flexibility for issuing money and funds back for the promise of plantings on site.
So since we're on number 4, we can work backwards maybe. The question I have is, currently, if you're doing a subdivision in this particular case, you would say, here's all my credit trees, they're in the open space, whatever, mitigation, and then I've got this additional that I need to pay for. So typically they would go ahead and pay that up front and then start their construction. And you're saying this basically allows a mechanism for them to start getting some of that back if they provide additional mitigation on site. Is that correct? Or are they paying more upfront in this scenario?
So they're not paying any more than what would be required per our code. This is really just and maybe it needs to be adjusted to where it allows for the submittal of the mitigation plan after construction plans are approved. But really the way it is intended to work is just to allow, instead of the planting at the time of construction, which is what's required now, the planting can occur after construction has been, for the most part, done. So, at like 80% completion of the project, that's when all the planting can go in. That way plants or trees aren't being damaged during the construction process. So it gives the developer the ability to move forward with approval on construction plans without the requirement of them planting during construction. And then it allows us to credit the money back once we've verified that all those plantings have been installed.
Okay, that makes some sense. And is finance okay with this? Keep records of all this.
I'd say if we get approval on it, that's when we'll take it to finance and work all that out, definitely.
I think that goes back to having more options for developers. I think they would appreciate another tool.
That's what it sounds like. Yeah.
Right. Great. So if we're working backwards, if we go back up to number 3, do y'all have any thoughts or guidance on where we should encourage or allow or disallow on-site mitigation in a residential subdivision?
I think this scenario sounds good. If they can, it's kind of like planting in the park. Option number 4 on what's in place now. If they can make it work for the open space and common areas, then it's addressing the issue, which is we are replacing trees.
I would, Amy, is this one of those issues you wanted to discuss?
Yes, I would. I'd love to be able to add to that when appropriate.
Well, it's appropriate. Jump in there.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I appreciate all of you guys working so hard on looking at all of the tree ordinance and the options. You guys are very qualified and brought up a lot of ideas and information that I've never even looked at in the tree ordinance. So thank you guys so much for y'all doing that. So I work for Blake McGee Company, and we are doing the Parkside on the River development that's on 2243. That's part of the old Water Oak project on 29. Our tree ordinance that we deal with is a little different. We were vested to the 2011 UDC, and we have the tree ordinance that's commonly known as the Hillwood deal, which has some additional requirements in it. So, but I have worked a lot with the current ordinance just in cross-referencing, and there were a couple of items that I contacted PJ about and have been working quite a bit with Sophia on, and Steve some. You know, typically in our master plan communities, we get credit for trees that we plant on single family lots. So if we plant 2 3-inch trees on every lot and 4 3-inch trees on every corner lot, we typically are allowed in other jurisdictions to get credit for every tree that we plant. We require those trees to be planted in our deed restrictions, and that is in perpetuity of the project. That's a requirement, and kind of goes along with the management company that is managing the project, similar to when they're sending out violation notices for on-street parking or trash cans being left out too long. One of their checklist items is if a tree is if it dies or it's replaced with something that's not a correct tree. Sometimes occasionally you'll have someone try to replace something with a palm tree or something strange like that. You know, that is something that that is watched and verified for the life of the project. So that was something new to us in Georgetown that we were not aware of, that right now it doesn't, I don't think the ordinance is being interpreted to get mitigation for every tree that you plant. And we're working with staff right now on our project, but we did a snapshot of a tree survey of one of the portions of our development that was about 600 lots and about 300 acres. So we did the tree survey, and we have a lot of heritage trees on those projects, or trees that are categorized as heritage trees. They may not be 26 inches or greater, but they may be multi-trunk clusters that are categorized as heritage trees. And so we have a lot of credit trees as well. But when we went through and did the calculations, even if we assume that we do get credit for the trees that are planted on all the single family lots, we have 3,000 inches that we still have to plant. In addition to every planting that we would normally do on our parkway and on our collector roadways and in our amenity centers and all of our trees and our single family lots, we still have to figure out where to place another 3,000 inches, which is, if we assume a 3-inch tree, that's 1,000 trees we have to come up with on the roadways, right now, the common areas, roadways, ponds, and we just can't meet that requirement because of the spacing and everything else. So we have a real problem on that section of 600 lots. How do we meet the ordinance and the spirit of it? The only option we really have at this point is to pay an additional fee, because we can't even plant that number of trees in that space. So that's something that we're new into the process. We're new in developing Georgetown. So it's something we've been working through. And the other piece of the puzzle that we've been looking at is, a lot of times when we develop in a master plan community, the community project is looked at as a whole. So if we have a surplus of trees in one section, we can apply that credit to another section. If we have a deficit of trees in one section, then as you're going forward, it's kind of like a running total for the project. So those are the two items specifically that we brought up to Sophia and PJ. And I think we've talked to him a bit on it. So that's just some of the things that we would like to look into, that we're have some concerns with for our project. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, those are all good points. And I guess I'm kind of curious what the city's take on that is.
Well, I'm sure Steve might be able to answer. I don't know how in the weeds he's in on this. Sophie and I have been working on it, but we don't really have an answer yet.
Yeah.
We're still working together on it.
Yeah, the biggest thing right now is currently the code doesn't allow for residential street yard plantings to count towards mitigation. And one of the larger issues behind that reasoning is the fact that the city doesn't have a way to control if those trees remain on site. It's tough to say in the long run, economic wise, decision-making wise, however it goes, HOAs change. So I don't think you can ever truly safeguard against that, which is why it's currently not an option for mitigation. The city prefers that plantings that occur are generally occurring on property that is not owned by an individual, but owned by, in the case of an HOA, it's community property within that subdivision. So the HOA is responsible for maintaining that area versus an individual homeowner. So that's what we're struggling with right now, is to figure out if there's an answer for that option.
Amy, what other cities are dealing with this, or allow this, that you're working with?
So we've worked in Kyle. The city of Austin also allows credit for single family trees planted. Leander, Round Rock, when we worked out there. So I know Sophia has looked at a lot of the jurisdictions, and they all have slightly different code requirements on that. Some give you some credit, some give you partial credit. I believe she told me Cedar Park doesn't give any credit. So I think the surrounding jurisdictions have a lot of code variations on that.
No. I mean, I personally, I have no problem with it. I do see the cities concern over control, but I mean, if, you know, HOAs have a lot more legal power than they used to have in the older days. So I don't know. It seems to me if it's a legitimate HOA, there should be something.
Never experienced in any of our projects over the last 20 years of anybody largely coming through and taking out trees that are planted on the homes there, because that's adds value to the homes.
Right.
And most people really want their trees and the builders want their trees. So the only thing we've ever experienced, and it's just a handful of times that I can think of, is when a tree has died and they've come back and tried to plant something that is not, you know, doesn't meet the requirement of a replacement tree.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any heartburn over that. To me, it makes sense, but I don't know. Philip, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I was gonna, aren't 2 trees required for each lot as part of the requirements for planting residential lots, or is that not true?
Currently, it's viewed at 50 linear feet. So your corner lots are generally the ones that end up with 2, and non-corner lots really only see one tree per the city's current requirement for residential trees in the street yard.
Okay. Yeah, and then I guess one argument that could be brought up is when we're talking about HOAs, whether it's common area managed by the HOA or somebody's lot managed by the HOA may have the same situation. That could be thought of that way, that they have control of it somewhat. From the city's perspective, how would that be different? Does the city have more control over the HOA for their common areas than they do for public citizens?
Yeah, so in the, do you mind? Steve, did you have something you want to say?
Go ahead.
So the HOA common areas would be, if there were ever going to be any changes made to it, they would be permitted and reviewed through the site plan process, like a non-residential development, but where we can assess, where we can enforce all of our tree provisions. Changes made to residential home, you know, if a tree is going to change, don't have to go through that process. So, you know, there's no enforcement mechanism on our end. Other things to consider is that cities in Texas don't have the ability to enforce deed restrictions on properties. The state law just prohibits us from enforcing those. We're not party to them. So we also couldn't, if the HOA for some reason stopped enforcing those requirements or even changed that requirement, then we couldn't enforce that. And then the last thing to consider is that state law sets a lot of parameters and around how we can regulate tree preservation on single family homes. I don't think we're encroaching on any of those parameters at the moment, but we're probably in the realm of those boundaries the state's set for us.
Okay, thank you.
It sounds like we have some general questions about this. Is there anything? So we may not be ready to make a decision today, but is there any information that we can get for you or put together for our next meeting that would help make a decision?
Yeah, I guess I'm sure there is. I mean, I don't know. Is there any language maybe that the city during the site plan process can require the developer to insert into their HOA restrictions that require, you know, instead of just a majority to overrule that particular rule, maybe it's a super majority, or it requires, you know, 90% of the homeowners to overturn that or something, you know what I'm saying? Can they require language that would, I don't know. I'm just throwing stuff out there.
So the thing with that, PJ, like Ethan was mentioning, the only concern with putting something like that on an HOA or requiring them to put that on private restrictions is what Ethan just said, is that the city it's not a party to those restrictions. So we do not administer, enforce them, or approve them. You know, it's like, you know, we have a lot of situations and projects that they'll say, well, you know, we'll put this in private restrictions so that you have that assurance that guarantee that this is going to occur. But the issue is that because we don't approve them, we can only enforce standards that we adopt via ordinance.
No, I get that. I get that. I'm just saying, if the issue is whether that, you get, after about 5 years, you get the HOA gets together and says, this is a stupid rule, let's just overrule it. Well, you and I know in most 99% of the subdivisions, you can't get 100% or even sometimes half the people to okay, a change in the rules. But you just make it where it's so difficult to overturn that as a condition of approving your site plan. I know you can't enforce it, but you can enforce the fact that they put that in their HOA restrictions, right?
Yeah.
Well,
I think for next time, what we could do is we can work with our legal team before our next meeting to clearly understand where we can step in and make those kinds of requests to the developer and where we can't.
Maybe that's overstepping. I don't know. That's for the lawyers.
Yeah.
Well, and we will, I mean, Ethan is correct. We'll certainly do that and explore those options. The only thing that I would add to also keep in mind is that, with site plans, especially now being subject to shot clock, we have to determine how it meets with all the requirements in order for it to be approved. Because even if we impose conditions in a site plan, well, it's technically not final approved until those conditions have been met.
Yeah.
And so, but we'll certainly do that and come back to you to see what we can actually do, what's within our purview to be able to accomplish on that.
Sure.
So if we move back to number 2, this is related to the percentages of trees that you can remove over the percentage that have to stay, and whether or not those should be assessed at an additional level of fees or mitigation ratios to encourage compliance with the ratio.
And is that, should those be changed administratively now? Or negotiated, I should say?
The amount of trees that are going to remain?
Percentage.
Yeah, so currently you could go through the AE process to increase that amount, the amount that could be removed.
It is limited to the 10% though.
You can increase it 10% or decrease or increase 10%. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
So this option would also would remove that entire requirement of the AE from the process. So it would just be a straightforward solution for development and developers that can't meet that minimum requirement due to what they're trying to build. So yeah, it's as far as from a time standpoint, it's a faster process.
You're considering maybe adding more tiers to that?
Correct. Yeah.
I don't know. I guess, submit some and let's talk about it. Maybe,
I think generally it sounds appropriate the way you're handling it, making it more of an administrative process than a longer process. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Would you be in support of, if somebody was going to come in and request to remove more trees than typically allowed, do you think it could be supported that the trees that are moving above and beyond what is typically allowed could be assessed at a higher mitigation fee, 1.5 times or 2 times whatever the other trees were moved at? Do you think that would incentivize developers, or do you think they would see that as another roadblock?
Well, one question would be, how often do you see that happening with projects where they go over the minimums? Every day? Once a week? I don't know.
It happens more often than not. And that's the reason it's being brought up, is that it's happening more often than not. And we don't have a mechanism for either keeping the process going or incentivizing meeting our requirements. as a city and keeping those minimum requirements on the site. So.
Okay.
Yeah, so this would kind of be in exchange for not having to go through an administrative process, in exchange for just working out with Steve. You know, maybe you pay slightly more for the trees that Steve let you move.
Yeah.
Are there other cities doing something similar?
Currently, I don't believe other cities address this in their code. So not this option. That would be something that I would need to take a look at in more detail and see if I can find any specific language as far as how they handle it or don't handle it, I guess.
So one other question would be, is this proposal a replacement of the current process or an option? Or could it be an option?
It would be a replacement.
It would be a replacement, okay.
Yeah. So it would be anything up to the 20%. So the way the code reads is you're required to keep 20% of trees unless it's between 1 and 10, and then you're required to keep 30% of protected trees. So anything up to that 30% range is mitigated at the existing rate, and then anything in excess of that requirement would be mitigated at a different rate. So either a higher ratio for plantings or $50 bump per inch, something along those lines. So.
And the purpose here that I'm hearing is to incentivize on-site keeping the trees essentially, right?
Right.
Not pay that extra, okay.
Yeah.
So
And one other question, just real quick. Do you see this happening more so on large projects or small projects? The going over the minimums?
Generally, this occurs on projects that are small, but also just confined. You know, you run into this situation on oddball lots. You also run into it on smaller lots, where with all the other requirements on the lot per our code, parking, setbacks, things like that, you don't have the room required for the development coming in. So, and that forces them to go into the AE process, and it can be back and forth type negotiation as far as how that's addressed. So this gives them a clean, clear-cut path to getting their project through the development process.
So this chart that shows the 30 and the 20%, that does not exist now, correct?
That does exist now. That is the requirements currently.
Okay.
If you want to remove more than that in those scenarios, that this comes into play.
Correct.
I mean, generally speaking, without doing the math and understanding if it's really a benefit to the developer or not, I'm assuming it is, because time always matters. But to what cost, I guess that would be I don't know what kind of information you could provide to kind of show that, to say on a typical site, they're going to end up paying an extra $100,000 where it's $5,000.
we can put together some examples for our next meeting.
That would be helpful.
Kind of showing you what what a project paid and what they would have paid.
Yeah.
If this had been in place.
I think that would be very helpful in evaluating.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like all of these projects. I'm not advocating for one side or the other, but it does come down as a tug a tug of war between how badly do we want to save our trees versus how badly do we want to limit growth? You know, I mean, that's kind of what you're getting into. It's like, I don't know, it's the balance between, I don't know. Anyway, you understand. Yeah, send us more examples.
So now if we go back up to number 1, this is a discussion of whether or not the protected tree class might be split into 2 to kind of address the fact that a mitigation for a 12-inch tree is the same as the mitigation for a 24-inch tree. Do y'all see any room for that, or do you have any comments on that?
So if we're always talking about a delta, let's call it, you know, what somebody's dealing with now and what they'll be dealing with the next time. And again, I understand, and I'm not saying we need to fight for the developer. What we need to do is just understand how it impacts and what it's going to do. For instance, if we were to split the protected trees into 2 scenarios, then a possibility could be, well, the lower protected trees actually go down in mitigation costs while the bigger ones go up, just to even it out as a possible option of how this change can be palatable. That's one thought. But I understand what you're getting at, because a 25-inch tree, you know, sometimes it's like the developer looks at it like, I dodged that bullet. But it would be nice to have those trees still in place if at all possible.
I agree.
Okay. So next time we can. So next time we can bring back some options of what that may look like, to maybe slightly reduce the lower end of a protected tree and increase the higher end. Figure out where that split might be best placed.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to at least approach it, and then we can see.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. Well, issue number 12, our last one, I promise. This relates to, Andrea spoke on this very well earlier, and this relates to what happens when all these trees that we require folks to plant in their street yards, between their building and the street, grow up and mature. So this has come up several times over the past probably 9 months to a year, where we have had multiple requests from business owners who wish to cut down some of their street yard trees because they're now blocking the signage on their business. So the example on the left is actually from Raising Cane's. I'm sorry, my example on the left is IHOP. See, I don't even know what it was. That's IHOP on I-35 frontage at Rivery Boulevard. That has been an issue. And the picture on the bottom right is the Raising Cane's 29 in Wolf Lakes Drive. So the issue here is that the code allows a property owner to remove them and to replace them, but it's not very specific. It just says you can remove it when it's blocking signage. So the past few times we've worked through this with the developer, it's been a negotiation between Steve and Landscape Architect as to exactly how those trees should be removed and how they should be replaced. Steve, can you talk about the solution? You can say it better than I can.
Sure. So our code currently allows them to request the removal of a tree based on blocking of existing signage. So when this comes up, what's taken into consideration is other options prior to just removal. There's pruning that's looked at. Is it possible to prune the tree in a way that signage is still visible? Was the tree there prior to the building? And it was part of the plan as far as mitigation or gateway requirement, all the other factors that play into the site development. Ultimately, the way it's gone so far is they haven't really been able to remove the trees per the request. It's been more of a pruning, and that is generally the solution because of the mitigation requirements associated with the removal of the tree and the fact that they still need to meet the requirements that the site plan had imposed. So yeah, the intent of this is to just kind of clarify that, you know, if a tree is going to get removed, where does that tree end up on site? It doesn't just get replanted in the rear of the site where it's not a benefit to city, and it's not meeting the requirement of the gateway or the street yard, things like that. So this is meant to focus on how we address the replacement of those trees on the site when this issue comes up. So,
Well, my first thought is, why are we allowing street trees to be planted in front of signs in the first place? I mean, that should be considered from the day you get your CO. Or before.
right. So in a few projects now, I've aimed to make it very clear that, you know, there's the requirements that we have, our landscaping requirements, but at the same time, the consideration for site visibility for your signs need to be taken seriously. So, you know, just planting, as you can see here in the lower right corner, that was just probably the standard planting plan that was developed for that property. It doesn't look like any considerations were really taken to group the trees together to open up an area for visibility of the sign. That's what I urge developers to currently take that into consideration. So, I mean, honestly, the trees that are required, shade trees, it should be understood that those trees are going to mature over time and get to a certain size, and the potential for disruption of views and sight lines to the buildings is understood. So where we come into play on a lot of these requests is it's so far down the line that it either wasn't being considered back when the site plan was originally developed, or something was deviated from the original site plan during the construction process. So for instance, the IHOP was, I believe the sign was potentially moved to a slightly different location, which put it closer to the existing tree that was on site. And now that tree is almost fully engulfing that sign. So it's, you know, not an ideal situation for the commercial product.
And if I may also add on to that, so typically the way that our process involves right now is that, you know, the first application in the process when it comes to developing a site, you know, assuming that it's platted and all of that, is your site plan. In your site plan application, while you are required to show the location of the sign, you're not required to show the details of the sign or any sort of measurements or dimensions of the sign. They're only required to be shown on there for references purposes, because we make it very clear that the signs will be approved separately via a sign permit. So, you know, as Steve mentioned, we do try to address a lot of those from the beginning in the process and let them know, hey, this is something that you need to be aware of, you need to address to be able to avoid any conflicts in the future and so forth. But because signs are typically approved is towards the end of the process, after they've gotten their site plan approval, after they gotten their building permit approval, it's something that comes much later on. As Steve mentioned, usually they will either come in and now propose a sign at a different location than what was previously shown on their site plan, or it comes to a situation where now they've created a new, the sign that they ended up designing and doing, you know, ends up being based on the height and the location, ends up providing that conflict towards in the future. So we do see that this is further down the line of the road as opposed to the beginning of the process, even though we do our best to try and catch it at the beginning.
And this is mainly building signage we're talking about, not monument signs out front. It should be in front of the trees anyway, sometimes. Is
Actually,
that right? It's building signage usually.
in the two examples provided, it's actually one of each. So
Okay.
it's both the building signage on Canes and it's the monument sign for IHOP.
Okay.
So, yeah. I believe going forward, it would be more so the building signage than the monument sign, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when they replace a tree, based on what you're saying here, do they have, I guess it's not protected at this point typically, so there's no mitigation necessarily. They're getting approval to remove a tree and plant a new one that's smaller typically?
Right, mitigation is still required. So if they remove a tree that is 20 inches, something along those lines, if they can plant on site, they would plant everything that they could plant potentially on site, and then pay the difference. A lot of times it's just a flat out removal. We want to pay mitigation. That's the request. So, in cleaning up, as part of cleaning up this process, it's going to be really defining those terms as far as the removal process for this situation.
But on the mitigation, if it's an 8-inch tree they remove, there's no mitigation required, right? They just plant another 3-inch tree where y'all approve it to go.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So, if the only time, yeah. So if it's 8-inch, technically it's not considered protected by us, but if it was planted because of the requirement for the site development plan, it is protected in that instance, to where that's still a requirement for them to have a compliant site.
Okay.
What I should do is just wait till my tree gets to 11 inches and then cut it down and put up a 3.
That's what we don't want. That's what we don't want.
It's a simple solution, man.
PJ!
But you got to go through the approval process. That's the challenge.
Right, you still have to go through.
So generally speaking, back to this, the solution sounds reasonable. That it should still be, it needs to be required in the front like it needs to be. Just kind of put it in a new location. Sounds good to me.
It just seems like they ought to be a different species or something. I mean, if it's obviously going to grow right up, it's going to become another problem again, and you're going to have the same problem, 5-6 years down the road. I don't know. It seems to be more of an issue on the front end towards the landscaping requirements. I mean, I know we've got a whole bunch of existing situations, but that's something we need to fix on the front end for our landscaping requirements. But
and that's where tying back to other items that have been brought up, that's where the whole ornamental tree solutions come into play, and measuring of those and retaining those and keeping those as ultimately protected species.
But so you're recommending remove and replace with a similar tree somewhere on the grounds, correct?
Correct. So, yeah, recommending, in a sense, first and foremost, that on-site planting occurs within the same area, and other options are explored if that's not possible. So,
Can they do a fee in lieu of a tree?
Currently, currently it requires at least the mitigation of an on-site planting to replace that one tree. And then they could mitigate for fee in lieu beyond that.
Yeah, but they couldn't just, I'm just thinking of a smaller lot situation where they really don't have any room to put a new tree in, and they don't want to put another tree right back in front of their sign again. You know,
Right.
I'll just cut you a check for $1,000 and we're done, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that could be an option that we can explore. The only thing I guess just to keep in mind is that these are what required trees, right? So we also have, like, our code requires you to plant so many trees based on, you know, on your lot property. So if we, you know, a fee in lieu would then still result in them being deficient and non-compliant with that rule, regulation. So, but I guess it's something that we would have to explore to see how we can accommodate for that.
I mean, yeah, I know the goal is to keep trees around here, and you lose a tree in that scenario. But again, if sometimes it just doesn't fit, you know, I don't know what to say. Maybe that's an option that you have, I don't know.
The only last comment I have on the word is when it says of a similar size, I mean, when they got this approved in the first part, it was one of the approved plant list. And maybe that's the correct way to do it, that as long as it's still on that same plant list, the trees that meet the criteria for shade trees for that type of planting should be appropriate.
Correct.
All right.
Great.
Anybody else? What
All
else?
right. So I think we've gone through all of the issues. And so congratulations and thank you all for bearing it with us and being able to, I know there were a lot, but at least the good news is this was our biggest bucket. It was our biggest focus area. I mean, we had 12 just related to this. At the next meeting, you know, when we talk about the next focus area with street yards, gateways, and parking, we don't have as many issues. I think we only have about half of these. So it's going to be great. As mentioned, we'll, you know, we definitely had identified some follow-up items. You know, we need to bring back to you some options for you to be able to further explore and be able to discuss through. So at the next meeting, we'll continue and wrap up the conversation on tree preservation, removal, and mitigation so that we can make sure that we have that your final direction on those particular items. So be able to confirm that. And then, you know, start initiating the discussion on street yard gateways and parking. And we'll do the same exercise. We'll talk about the issues. We'll talk about potential solutions and be able to gain that direction from you and be able to validate from you to make sure that we're heading in the right direction so that we can go ahead and start, you know, finalizing that term sheet that Ethan mentioned, and then ultimately start drafting the ordinance for us to be able to discuss that. So with that, I think that is, hang on. Okay, there we go. So remember your homework, all right? Continue to reviewing the requirements so that you can come back and be ready to discuss those issues in particular and be able to discuss about, you know, what those possible solutions may be. Continue to observe, you know, landscape areas as you move around the city. In this particular case, especially since, you know, when it relates to gateways, since we are going to be talking about street yards and gateways and parking, really focus on those areas and be able to see, you know, how can we address some of those conflicts and some of those issues that we see when it comes to, you know, street yard requirements for buildings that are really far away, gateway requirements when you have big easements going along the roadway. So we can, you know, come back to us and really be able to go over and narrow down some of those possible solutions. So right now, the last question that we have for you, is there any additional information and resources that you need for the next meeting?
I don't think so. I appreciate y'all putting everything together beforehand like you did, getting it to us in time. So as soon as you get some of these other proposals of things we talked about today, I think the quicker you can get that to us, the better we can have it prepared for the next meeting, keep these things rolling. You've done great. great work.
Thank you.
Okay, Steve, especially Steve and Ethan, they spent a lot of long hours putting this together, so I can't take all of the credit for it. They've done a lot of work on this, so.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Ethan. Good job.
All right.
Thank you, Amy, for showing up. And anyway, I think if that's it, anybody have any more comments? If not, I will call the meeting to a close. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Uh,
Thank you,
Second
everybody.
it, if you need one. Bye.
All right.